Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. Now usually on this show we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks on a $25 budget, but today we have an episode of Quests for Quarters. On episodes like these I'm going to take you through underrated budget cards that you should be considering when you build your decks. For these episodes, not only does every card have to be under $1, but they also have to be used in less than 4,000 decks on EDH Rec. And as always, prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCG Player. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. First up we have Illusionist Gambit, which comes in at 91 cents and is being used in around 1,800 decks. It's an instant that costs 2 blue, and it says cast Illusionist Gambit only during the declare blocker step on an opponent's turn. Remove all attacking creatures from combat and untap them. After this phase, there's an initial combat phase. Each of those creatures attacks that combat if able. They can't attack you or planeswalker you control that combat. So that's really a lot of text, but the effect is rather simple. The opponent that attacked you has to untap all their attacking creatures and use those creatures to swing at someone else. This is personally one of my favorite combat tricks because not only does it protect you, but it can also set back multiple opponents. While it might be advantageous for an opponent to attack you, it might not be the same with someone else. You might seem completely defenseless and an easy target, so an opponent might swing a lot of their forces at you. By casting this, you're forcing them to change their plans and swing into a situation that they probably didn't want to swing into. Most of the times this turns into a combat step that's not beneficial for any of the other players. A lot of creatures might get lost in the shuffle, or someone that they didn't want to take damage is going to take a ton. My favorite time to cast this card is when other players have an alliance and they're forced to break it because of it. This is a very unique card and it can turn the tables on its own. Because it's such a unique card, there really aren't any other cards like it. A very powerful card that can be used as a combat trick is Cyclonic Rift. Now this is considered by some to be the most powerful card in Commander and it's used in a lot of situations. Currently it's $20.91 and it's used in 85,000 decks. Essentially if you cast it for its overload cost, it's going to return everyone else's non-land permanents back to their hand. Now this is much more than a combat trick, usually it's used to finish out games. And I'm not saying that I would put Illusionist Gambit in the same league as this card. But in terms of being used as a combat trick, Illusionist Gambit is still very effective. But in comparing these two just as being a combat trick, Illusionist Gambit can be better in certain situations. While Cyclonic Rift is going to bounce on land permanents, Illusionist Gambit can be a form of creature removal or even player removal. Again, in general, Illusionist Gambit is nowhere near as powerful, but it still deserves to be seen in more decks than it is. But perhaps we can see a more comparable combat trick with Aetherize. It has the same converted mana cost as Illusionist Gambit, and it says return all attacking creatures to the owner's hand. Currently it only costs 23 cents and it's seeing play in over 6,400 decks. This is definitely an effective combat trick because it's essentially a fog that sets that opponent back. It can be more effective in certain situations, but I prefer Illusionist Gambit to it. While Aetherize only sets one player back, Illusionist Gambit can set back multiple. Also, there might be certain creatures that you don't want to go back into their owner's hand because they have certain enter the battlefield effects. A similar combat trick to Aetherize is going to be Aether Spounce. It costs 3 blue and it says for each attacking creature, its owner puts it on the top or bottom of his or her library. Currently it costs 50 cents and is seeing play in 4,000 decks. This card is more effective than Aetherize because it's going to set our opponent back even further. But again, this effect only affects one opponent and not multiple. I'm not saying that it's not a good card, and I think it should be seeing more play, but I prefer Illusionist Gambit. Finally, there's a card that has perhaps the closest effect to Illusionist Gambit, but in a different way. And that card is Disrupt Decorum, which comes in at $6.62 and is seeing play in 2,700 decks. It's a sorcery that costs 2 red and it says go to all creatures you don't control. Basically that means that all of your opponent's creatures have to attack and they can't attack you. Now this card isn't necessarily a combat trick because you're casting it during your turn. It does somewhat have the same effect though, where your opponents have to attack each other. This is a very powerful card, but there are still disadvantages to it compared to Illusionist Gambit. First of all, this doesn't go to any creatures that came in after you cast it, so any hasty creatures can still attack you. Also, your opponent might have a way to either return some creatures back to their hand or tap those creatures so that they don't actually have to attack. That being said though, it's a great effect and I wish it was a little more budget so I could include it in some decks. But there just aren't too many cards that can force your opponents to attack each other, which is just a very powerful effect. And that's why Illusionist Gambit is a fantastic budget card to include in your decks and should be seeing much more play than it does. But now it's time to move on to our second Quest for Quarters card with the underrated Damir House Guard. Currently it's only 37 cents and is seeing play in just 2,900 decks. It's a 2/3 skeleton with fear that costs 3 and a black. It has Sacrifice a Creature, Regenerate Damir House Guard. And on top of that it has Transmute for 1 black, which means that you can pay that cost to discard it and search your library for a card that has a converted mana cost of 4 and put it into your hand. This card is absolutely incredible in any Aristocrat strategy and even some strategies outside of it. Aristocrat strategies are looking for free sacrifice outlets, and this is a fantastic one to include. Not only can this sacrifice any number of creatures for free, but it also protects itself when it does. Also, if you already have a good sacrifice outlet on the board, you can just transmute it to get a card that you actually need. This can even just be a 3-mana tutor in certain decks. But now let's look into some other comparable sacrifice outlets. First up, there's Yahenni Undying Partisan, which comes in at $2.33 and is seeing play in 8,300 decks. It costs 1 less than Damir Houseguard, and it has Sacrifice Another Creature. Yahenni gains indestructible until end of turn. On top of that, it has haste, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Yahenni. So the sacrifice effect is slightly better since it's indestructible instead of regeneration. Also, unlike Damir Houseguard, Yahenni itself can actually be a win condition. Yahenni is a fantastic sacrifice outlet, but I wouldn't say that Damir Houseguard is too far behind. On top of that, Damir Houseguard is a little more flexible because it can be used to tutor, whereas Yahenni can't. Also, Yahenni actually can't sacrifice itself, and sometimes that can be beneficial. Another popular creature sacrifice outlet is Viscera Seer. Currently, it's $2.36 and is seeing play in 17,000 decks. It has sacrifice a creature, scry 1. Now this does cost 3 mana less than Damir Houseguard, and it does help you with card selection, but it doesn't protect itself. Although Viscera Seer can provide a lot of value, I prefer sacrifice outlets that are a little more durable. Not that Viscera Seer shouldn't be seen in 17,000 decks, but Damir Houseguard should be in a lot more than it is, and it should be a lot closer. Another creature-based sacrifice outlet that's commonly used is Carrion Feeder. It costs a black and it starts off as a 1/1 that can't block, and it has sacrifice a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Again, even though this card is much easier to cast than Damir Houseguard, it still doesn't protect itself, and it doesn't provide that much value. In my opinion, Damir Houseguard should be seen in a lot more decks than Carrion Feeder, and that currently isn't the case. Even something like Vampiric Rites is seeing more play than Damir Houseguard, and that's absolutely absurd to me. Vampiric Rites is currently 23 cents and is seeing play in 4,400 decks. It's an enchantment that has pay 1 and a black, sacrifice a creature, you gain 1 life and draw a card. Yes, enchantments are harder to remove than creatures, but Damir Houseguard protects itself, so it's actually hard to remove. Vampiric Rites does provide you with some extra value by gaining you 1 life and drawing you a card, but you have to pay for it. And the best sacrifice outlets that are out there are ones that are free. With an Aristocrat style deck, you need to be able to sacrifice any number of creatures at any point. With a free sacrifice outlet like Damir Houseguard, there's absolutely no limit. Vampiric Rites, you are very limited because you have to pay 2 mana for each creature. In my opinion, that effect is nowhere near worth the cost. Damir Houseguard is a fantastic sacrifice outlet and definitely deserves to see more play than a lot of these cards. Let's go into our third Quest for Quarters card, which is a different kind of sacrifice outlet with Thermopod. Thermopod comes in at 21 cents and is somehow only seeing play in 413 decks. It's a 4/3 slug that costs 4 into red, and it says sacrifice a creature, add red to your mana pool. As I mentioned before, free sacrifice outlets are always going to be better than ones that have a mana cost. But a sacrifice outlet can be really broken if it actually gains you mana. Now, Thermopod might not be able to protect itself, but it more than makes up for that. In token or aristocrat style strategies, it can lead to a very explosive turn. Now, there aren't too many sacrifice outlets that actually generate mana, but let's go through them now. Phyrexian Altar comes in at $15.10 and is seeing play in 8,700 decks. It's an artifact that says sacrifice a creature, add 1 mana of any color. Now this card is better than Thermopod in pretty much every way. Phyrexian Altar is also going to be put in a lot more decks than it already is because its price just dropped. Now its current price is still nowhere near budget playable, but Thermopod's is. It's not a direct replacement, but Thermopod still has a very powerful effect. Another comparable sacrifice outlet is Ashnod's Altar, which comes in at $4.43 and is seeing play in 36,000 decks. It allows you to sacrifice a creature to add colorless to your mana pool. Again, Ashnod's Altar is better than Thermopod in most situations. It's an artifact, so it's harder to remove, and it gives you more mana. But Thermopod makes red mana, which can be better in a lot of situations. Both Ashnod's and Phyrexian Altar are staples when it comes to sacrifice outlets. Thermopod is by no means a staple, but it should be considered in red decks that run both of these. Let's get into a red sacrifice outlet for comparison's sake. Tooth and Claw comes in at 11 cents and is seeing more than twice as much play as Thermopod. It's an enchantment that allows you to sacrifice 2 creatures to put a 3/1 token into play. The fact that this is seeing more play than Thermopod to me is ridiculous. Yes, this effect can be powerful in certain decks. A 3/1 token is pretty good, but you do have to sacrifice 2 creatures. Thermopod lets you sacrifice any number of creatures and it nets you mana. And being able to generate pretty much free mana is always going to be broken in Commander. Thermopod should be seeing much more play and should always be considered in red decks that need to sacrifice creatures. But now let's go into our final Quest for Quarters card with Collective Unconscious. Collective Unconscious comes in at 41 cents and is seeing play in 2,800 decks. It's a sorcery that costs 4 green and it says draw a card for each creature you control. There are a lot of green decks out there that just want to put a ton of creatures on the board. This is especially true for Selesnya token decks, and there are plenty of those out there. Collective Unconscious can draw you an absurd amount of cards to keep your engine going. The most obvious comparison comes with Shamanic Revelation, which comes in at $1.22 and is being played in 13,000 decks. It does the exact same thing for 1 less mana, but it also has Ferocious. You gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. Yes, Shamanic Revelation is just a better Collective Unconscious, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be including Collective Unconscious too. Decks aren't running Shamanic Revelation for that specific life gain part, they're running it to draw cards. So I would argue that any deck that wants Shamanic Revelation also wants Collective Unconscious. Just because it's not as good doesn't mean that it shouldn't be included. Collective Unconscious is still a very powerful card. A similar but repeatable effect like this comes from Slate of Ancestry. Slate of Ancestry is currently seeing play in 3,100 decks and comes in at $2.26. It has 4 tap, discard your hand, draw a card for each creature you control. Now, you do have to discard your hand, but that's a very small price to pay for the effect. In comparing the two, Collective Unconscious is better right away, but Slate of Ancestry might be better over time. Regardless, both should be seeing more play than they are. And finally, let's compare Collective Unconscious to Regal Force. Regal Force comes in at 68 cents and is in 6,400 decks. It's a 5/5, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each green creature you control. When comparing it to Collective Unconscious, it definitely has some advantages, but it also has some disadvantages. Regal Force is a creature, so its effect can be more easily abusable, but it does cost 1 more and it can only draw you cards for green creatures. In comparison, Collective Unconscious draws you cards for each creature, so it should be able to fit in a lot more decks. Collective Unconscious might not be the best draw spell in green, but it's still a very effective one. As I said before, in my opinion, any deck that runs Shamanic Revelation should also be running Collective Unconscious. In the right deck, it's a very powerful way to draw a ton of cards at once. And with that, this show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you guys think about this episode, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying a deck or just individual cards, make sure to use our link in the description. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCG Player, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, check out some of our other episodes on budget deck techs, Quest for Quarters episodes, Commander topics, and Creators Quarters. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.